The space speed has never been hotter, with routine updates from NASA and JPL on their latest and greatest missions, to international space news, to America's space race with China, to all the latest in SpaceX and other new space entrepreneurs. There's never been more to say or wonder about in spaceflight. It's a hot ticket, and there will be jobs in journalism. Stay with us.
Podcasts you love.
From people you trust.
This is TWiT.
This is This Week in Space, episode number 19, recorded June 23rd, 2022. You can be a space journalist. Hello and welcome to another episode of This Week in Space, the Space Journalist Edition. Today, Tariq and I are going to talk about our craft, space journalism. It's a long curving trajectory from here to there, but an exciting and rewarding one most of the time. I'm Pyle, editor-in-chief of Ad Astra Magazine, a so-called prolific book author, and I'm joined by Tariq Malik, who is definitely a prolific journalist over at space.com. Say hello, my friend.
Hello. Hello, everyone.
Hello, everyone. Okay, before we proceed too far, I'd like to attempt to tickle your funny bone. I actually had to go far afield to find journalism jokes, but we'll give it a shot. Hey, Tariq.
Yes, Rod?
What is a mainstream media award for accurate, fair, and even-handed journalism today?
Well, I think you're going to enlighten me. What is that word?
A pink slip. Ba-dum, bang. Okay, better yet.
So pessimistic. So pessimistic. I think we're going to get to that in this episode. So
yeah, but it hasn't happened to us. So that's good. Okay. Or
okay.
Are we as a society ever going to reject clickbait journalism?
Ooh, this is careful. Are we? Do you think? What do you think? I may have been guilty of this in the past.
The answer may surprise you. Just try this one weird trick. All righty. Yeah,
no crickets for that one. That's a good one because it's accurate. So.
It's actually true, yeah. And it's got to have a picture of a cracked egg or a weird-looking guy with a beard on it. Well, weirder than me anyway. All right, well, before I impugn my integrity any further, let's get to some headlines from our friends at space.com. First up, Orbital Dodgeball. On June 16th, the ISS, the International Space Station, was once again maneuvered to dodge debris from the recent Russian anti-satellite test. Roscosmos used their Progress spacecraft, which is an uncrewed spacecraft that's docked at the ISS, to perform a roughly 4.5-minute burn of its engines to reposition the station away from a chunk of the Cosmos 1408 satellite, which had been defunct until the Russians blew it to smithereens. Large chunks would have passed within about a half mile of the station, but that's close enough to make NASA uncomfortable. And if there's a bright point to the story, it would be that at least the Russians had to use their own fuel to move the space station away from the problem that they created. Tariq, what else do you know about this one?
Well, this is a close to my heart. I wrote this story at space.com over the weekend after it happened. And, it just seems odd that we're still talking about anti-satellite weapons space debris when it's Russian debris that they created on purpose in November. They basically shot a missile at a satellite called Cosmos 1408. It's an old Soviet-era satellite. And they did it kind of just to show that they can. And by all accounts, back in November, it seemed like it even took Russia's space program by surprise that they did this. But it did create this massive cloud of debris that is orbiting the Earth right now, just above, I believe, the orbit of the space station, which is a couple hundred miles up. Which means that from time to time, that debris, as it falls back to Earth, is going to cross the space station's path. And if you can imagine like a pizza box with the space station in the center, that's kind of the grid that NASA and its partners want around the space station. They don't want anything unexpected to fly within this pizza box about 25 miles across. And that's what happened on June 16th when this debris event was detected. Luckily, they did move the space station. They were able to move it with this Progress spacecraft, Progress 81. That's its job. In addition to delivering supplies, it has a propellant module to move the space station. But if they're not able to move the space station in time, astronauts and cosmonauts have to go into shelters. That basically means they go into their return ships to come back to Earth. Right. And they didn't have to do that this time. Usually when there's a piece of debris Roscosmos likes to say, "Hey, look, it's debris from SpaceX's, launch from this or from this European thing." It is rare that they own up and they say that it was our debris. We created this debris and we're taking care of it. But Dmitry Rogozin, we've talked about him before, the chief of Russia's space program, did share on Telegram, which is where they're sharing everything, video and a post that said, "Yeah, we moved it because of this fragment that it's going to come into a close encounter with." And they actually showed video, Roscosmos did, of the maneuver, which was interesting because I hadn't seen that before from Roscosmos. But if you go to Telegram, we've got an embed of it on the site that was cross-posted to Twitter. You can see how the Progress does do a reboost of the space station by firing its thrusters, and basically they just fire it over time and it lifts the station up. They do that from time to time because there are a little bit of vestiges of the atmosphere, even hundreds of miles up where the station is. And so they have to reboost it from time to time to keep it aloft and going at 17,500 miles an hour.
It's worth remembering, when you're talking about orbital debris in the space station, we're talking about big chunks of metal here, depending on which piece of debris you're talking about. But years back, when the shuttle was still flying, they lost the front layer of one of their 5-layer windows in the orbiter due to a paint flake the size of a dime. So at these velocities, even something very small has a lot of kinetic energy. So if you got a piece of metal the size of a baby, or even a piece of ice moving in the wrong direction at 17,000 miles an hour, it can do substantial damage. So this is not a trivial matter. All right, next up, this one we like to call a hungry Jupiter. This was another space.com story. I loved your headline. That wasn't it, but that was mine. In a nutshell, the remains of cannibalized baby planets are recently found at Jupiter's belly, helping to refine theories of the gas giant's formation. This is something we've been wondering about for well over 100 years, trying to figure out how this largest of our planets formed. The data came from NASA's Juno probe, which has been orbiting the planet for, I think, 7 or 8 years now, looking at gravitational data from below the cloud layers on the surface of Jupiter. And those cloud layers have obscured visual observation since we first started looking at it when Galileo turned his little tiny telescope to the planet. But now that we are able to get indirect data, it revealed large amounts of rocky material deep inside the planet, along with the surprising abundance, and I think this was the thing that sort of tipped the story, of heavy elements indicating that Jupiter began life as an accretion of planetesimals, or small protoplanets, as opposed to just a large variety of early solar system junk, just like the other planets we've looked at, the terrestrial planets, which we've explored in some detail. So Jupiter is found to have the equivalent of about 11 to 30 Earth masses tucked away inside its core, and the accretion of large masses inside could explain the abundance of the heavy elements that were detected, and may actually have solved the long enduring mystery of how it was formed. What do you think?
Well, this is really cool. This story actually came from our friends over at Live Science, which is a sister publication to space.com. Mm-hmm. And Harry Baker wrote this one from over there. And it's really interesting when you wonder exactly how these giant planets formed in the first place. A lot of scientists credit Jupiter's existence for our life on Earth too. You and me sitting here talking about how awesome Jupiter is because Jupiter, being so massive, was able to kind of keep the inner solar system clean with its gravity by sucking in, or I guess it would attract all of the comets or whatever that could have doomed Earth and life evolving on our planet from the get-go. But exactly how that planet formed and why it's the biggest and not a binary star is one of those big questions. And, we all know the kind of accepted theory that there's this big cloud of gas and dust that was the earliest solar system, and over time gravity clumped everything together. But no, this suggests from the Juno spacecraft that it was much more of a, I don't want to say like a violent experience, but you have, instead of it just being a slow vacuum and Play-Doh type thing where you're just sweeping up all this material in its orbit, it was really things crashing together and then melting in this really hodgepodge of collisions over time. And it's just fascinating to think that, if this planet formed like that, is that how Saturn formed, or Neptune, or Uranus? No jokes, Rod, about Uranus, please. And
Promise.
and
You know me
and what
too
does
well.
that mean? And what does that mean for the creation of the rocky planets too? Were we just dust in the wind, if you would, or was it just more smaller chunks smashing around earlier in the solar system's history?
Yeah, and I guess if you extend this story out, people ask about why are we so interested in Jupiter? It's just a big ball of gas and so forth. Increasingly, as we're looking at other star systems and trying to identify exoplanets, particularly places where we might think there could have been a chance for life, right here in our own solar system, we're understanding more and more how critical Jupiter was, not just to how the solar system formed, but the fact that Earth is able to sustain life. I mean, everything from the fact that it has its own large satellite that creates tides to, as you point out, both the formation of the inner planets, the way they came together and the masses they have, and keeping that area relatively free of orbital debris until you get out to the asteroid belt. So it's a big part of the story. And we're finding Jupiter-type planets, I believe, in most of the exosystems we're looking at. But it appears more and more that kind of where that large planet is and how many there are is kind of critical to whether or not we're going to find life in these other places, right?
Yeah, I think the most common detections of planets up until recently have been those super Jupiters or super Neptunes. Those gas giants, because they're the biggest that they can see. Their gravitational effects on their stars are more perceptible, and so we're seeing a lot of those planets out there and how they stack up and what role they play, not just in the formation of themselves and other gas giants, but in their own alien solar systems. That's what we're hoping to understand by seeing how Jupiter formed and then how that formation affected the birth of our early solar system.
All right. And next and final, we have Here Comes the Sun. We have a period of increased solar activity coming up, and we knew that's the case because the sun goes through cycles of activity where it dips and peaks and dips and peaks on roughly 11-year cycles. And astronomers and other scientists try to figure out in advance how severe these are going to be, how powerful they're going to be, because we have to know as much as we can in advance how much interference there's going to be with satellites. I mean, if you get solar activity, meaning solar flares and coronal mass ejections and so forth, if there's too much of that activity and too much energy coming off the sun, it can affect everything from the temperature of our atmosphere to the function of satellites. If you get too much energy or radiation coming in the satellites, it can actually affect their function. We depend on satellites much more now than ever for everything from tracking agriculture and ships at sea and even transit of trains and trucks to more commercial data like Target trying to figure out how many people are shopping at Walmart over Christmas. This is all satellite data, and of course tracking climate change among other things and weather prediction. So you want to make sure those machines are going to keep working and not either fail in orbit or re-enter. And of course, this story is, as you were talking about earlier, Tariq, is about the fact that when the sun goes into a high energy cycle like this, it sort of supercharges our atmosphere. Things heat up, the atmosphere increases, and it creates more drag on low orbiting satellites. And in fact, this is what brought Skylab down in the late 70s. It was supposed to be up in orbit, we thought, until the early to mid 80s. And the idea was a space shuttle would go up and nudge it into a higher orbit where it would be safe. Unfortunately, while the shuttle was continuing to be developed prior to it being launched and running a little behind schedule, we had an extra active solar activity cycle, and that actually caused the atmosphere to swell and more drag on Skylab, and down it came in a number of large chunks. So what do you know about this current cycle, and what may be the potential effects of it? Why are we worried about it?
Yeah, so currently we're in solar cycle 25. That's the numbering system that scientists use to measure the 11-year cycle that the sun has when it has its rises in activity. They call it solar maximum. When it has these really long lulls where it's relatively quiet, we don't see a lot of sunspots or a lot of flares. They call that solar minimum. And what's happening now, basically solar cycle 25 started in 2020. So it's been going on for a couple of years now. And they've noticed, scientists have noticed an uptick in the sun's activity. So they thought, okay, we may be in a really active phase, maybe approaching solar maximum in the years to come. And this story is from Teresa Poltarova, our writer in London at space.com. And she was talking to some scientists at the European Space Agency who oversee the Swarm satellite constellation, which is a series of satellites in orbit that are studying the Earth. And what scientists there had found is that since December, that's December of 2021, so just recently, those satellites are sinking. They're falling out of space 10 times faster than they were before in the years prior. So clearly, there's increased drag on the satellites where they're orbiting the Earth. And that drag is from the puffiness of the atmosphere that we talked earlier about reboost for the space station, as it's being affected by this increased solar activity. And our listeners, you might have heard we had a series of big flares in recent weeks and months. You might have heard about the giant sunspot that was 3 times the size of the Earth. We spotted that too. That might even be, things like that could be visible from to observers with solar eclipse glasses, protective stuff. Do not stare at the sun without that kind of thing. But it has an effect on these satellites. And the most dramatic was when SpaceX launched a whole batch of Starlink satellites in, I believe it was in March of this year, where they just fell out of space almost immediately because it happened during a really hot period of increased activity of the sun, and the drag was just too much for them to handle at the lower orbit that they were deployed at.
It was just a handful of them, though, right? It was 10 out of 40 or something?
It was, 10 out of 40 is still a multi-million-dollar loss, right? That's the, to me, a few is like 1 or 2, but not a big batch of them like that. And so when they, you would say, oh, maybe that's just a one-off. You got to time your launches to be better. This data from the European Space Agency says that no, we're seeing this with our own satellites now. If they're sinking too fast, it means they have to use more fuel, which then shortens the lifetime of that satellite because they, once they're in space, unless there's a gas station, which, there are plans for things like that, they're not going to be able to refuel themselves easily. And that means that instead of lasting for 15 years, maybe it's 10, maybe it's 5 if they have to do a lot of this. And so there are many more satellites now than there were in 2011 when we were at the same kind of phase of the sun's activity back then. And there are only going to be more. SpaceX is launching dozens at a clip with its Starlink constellation. OneWeb launches 3 or 4 dozen when they're launching their batches too. So that's just something that is it's gonna grow over time, and these constellation operators and mega constellation operators will have to deal with that and factor that into their plans. How are they going to keep them up in space? How often do they have to be prepared to maneuver? How will that affect their bottom line of having to build or buy new satellites to keep their services going? You just mentioned earlier, we rely on these satellites for everything, for finding where we're going to go on a trip with GPS, which those satellites are a lot higher, so they're not as affected, to the communication satellites that we rely on a day-to-day basis. And, there's these new internet constellations that will affect your connectivity if those satellites, have to be moving around so much that they're out of range on a regular basis. So just it's going to get worse because we're not at maximum yet, but the activity is increasing. And that's what this report is really kind of sounding the horn for, I think.
Well, it is probably also worth mentioning, we don't have a lot of risk on the Earth's surface from moderate levels of increased solar activity because we're protected by both our atmosphere and the magnetic field. But in the future, when there's astronauts living on the lunar surface, and especially in the Lunar Gateway, which is essentially just a big metal can that'll be orbiting the moon, when we have these increased solar activity cycles, there's dangers to them as well, right?
Yeah, that's right. And, there was a bit of luck involved in that those early crewed missions to the moon did not have these huge spikes or solar flares. If that's headed right at us, a massive coronal mass ejection that flings out solar plasma at 1 million miles an hour, there isn't much aside from taking shelter in maybe like an underground cavern that astronauts would be able to do. In fact, James Michener's Space, I think that's a pivotal. That's a deep pull. I'm not sure if our listeners have ever read that book, but one of the scenes, I think they're on like Apollo 18 or 19 or whatever it is at the end of that book. they are hit by this solar flare, and it has catastrophic results. That is something that NASA and all of their partners for Artemis need to plan when they're sending astronauts, not just to the surface, but to the Gateway space station around the moon, on missions to Mars, which SpaceX wants to do. You need to have a plan to shelter your astronauts if there is a major flare that is directed at them. We've seen missions to Mars that have been seriously damaged. Japan's Nozomi mission, for example, crippled by a solar flare. Yeah, these are robotic missions. There weren't people on board, but they caused lots of problems over time, and some missions had been lost because of it.
Well, definitely something to keep our eye on. All right. Well, we're going to be back in a couple of minutes to discuss your future as a space journalist after this short message from our sponsors. All right. Let's talk about space journalism. Now, this is, to me, an interesting discussion. I mean, besides the fact I'm involved in it, it's also kind of a weirdly different area of journalism right now. There's a lot of places that have hot news items. Most of them aren't quite as much of a splinter of the overall news conversation as space has been. And when I started doing this, I don't know, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, maybe at the earliest, it was kind of this is a very small niche. And that's not quite as much the case anymore because space has really become a hot topic. A lot of it is because of our friends at SpaceX and Blue Origin and some of the other privateers that are out there doing their business, and it's been kind of a boon to what we do. It hasn't necessarily resulted in larger paychecks, but that's another part of the conversation. So what is space journalism at this point? Well, it's anything from what we see on mainstream news, which are usually fairly short and not terribly informative segments, to something like space.com, which is a deeper dive but really designed for a fairly large lay audience, to things like Space Review and Space News, which are more designed for people in industry or trained in some way in that field, because they tend to get a little deeper into the stories, and there's a lot of talk about what's going on in government and Air Force and that kind of thing. So it covers a pretty wide field, but today I think what we're going to look at really is kind of the middle of this, which is the kind of stuff that you do at space.com. And I've admired your site for a long time, and I have no idea how hard it is to be working on that minute by minute, because I run a quarterly magazine, right? So I have to collect things every 3 months and get ready to do a big splash with it. But you actually have to update things minute to minute, day by day. You got a lot of plate spinning there. And how many people do you have working for you now, if you include all the freelancers?
Oh, if you include all the freelancers, man, that's really, really difficult. You know, we've had a 5-person news team, I think 6 now, on just news alone. We also have people that cover telescopes and technology as well, for buying guides and helping people express their inner space geek on planet Earth, because we don't all get to go to space. But space.com right now is a pretty strong and robust team. If you factor in freelancers, which we have many, it's easily well above 10 or 15 folks. But the core team, there's like 10 or so of us that are trying to work around the clock. We're part of the Future Network, which means that we've got folks in the UK, we've got folks here in New York and New Jersey, which is where I live, and then also in California. Mike Wall, he's out over there watching Silicon Valley and SpaceX and all the fun stuff that they're doing. So, it's really an exciting time, but it is, I came up with newspapers and the Los Angeles Times. I think we're going to talk a little bit about that in the future. And so I've kind of geared towards that. Everything is happening right now, and you have to get that story out because, you've got to hit your deadline. And I think the internet really, like the current readers are used to having stuff 24 hours a day. And so the audience is built to look for that. And that really drives, I think, a lot of what we're seeing right now with the many different publications that are geared just for space, the different flavors of space news that people can get. If they just like video, they can get that from folks. If they just like one company, like SpaceX's Starship, that NASA spaceflight will have live views 24 hours a day of those rockets on the pad as they're being built. So there's a lot of variety now. And space.com, we're trying to be like the destination. I don't think I should say trying. I think that we are the kind of the place where you're going to get everything. Just, you're going to get space flight, science, entertainment and whatnot. And I treat it a lot like a wire, where we're going forward. So, but in terms of space journalism right now, I mean, I wasn't around in the 60s, Rod. I don't want to say anything about
ask
folks,
Grandpa here. I can tell you everything you need to know.
But there is so much going on right now that there is such a wealth of information that people can tap into, and there are many ways to do it now. There wasn't an internet during the first space age, and we are arguably in a new space age where there's so many things all happening all around the world, all at the same time, that as a reporter, I feel very spoiled for choice. But also it's very stressful because you want to make sure you're choosing the right things to follow so that you don't miss, the next big Sputnik moment, the next big moon landing moment, or the companies that could lead to that.
Well, and I don't want to dwell on the past too much, but because I was around in the 60s, I was young when I was here. It was such a different scene then because we had 3 major television networks with some more local affiliates, but that was that. And we had a handful of radio networks across the country, and we had newspapers. So in the morning, you could pick up your newspaper and read whatever news they chose to cover. And in the evening, you'd click onto the news at 6 o'clock or 11 o'clock, and you were fed whatever they had on their docket for that day. But it was really a one-to-many on their schedule kind of thing. And there was a 24-hour news cycle internal to those operations, but the output wasn't. And the expectation wasn't that it was going to be there in 5 minutes. It was, whether it was print or radio or television, it was on their schedule. So it was much more structured, much more prepared, different kind of reporting, I think, and in general, much better paychecks and more structured existence for the journalists themselves. And now that we have, of course, as you point out, the internet was the big shift here. We're on a 24-hour cycle. I mean, there's people that have cameras looking at the Starbase down in South Texas where SpaceX is working on Starship all day long, all day and all night. And if there's so much as a bird landing on one of the starships that's sitting at the launch pad waiting to be launched, hopefully in the next few months, that's a moment that you can watch, and you can watch it live. And when they were doing the wet dress rehearsal for the Artemis 1 over the weekend and into the early part of this week, there wasn't much to see, but if you wanted to sit and stare at that rocket 24/7, you could on NASA TV. So it's a very different environment.
NASA broadcast that live webcast every day since June 6th. In fact, I think you can still see it right now. So it might still be live until it goes back into the barn. So yeah, there's a lot of options that people can have, and it's not the technology really. I mean, just in the 20 years that I've been with space.com, it's been amazing. When I first started covering spaceflight, which was in 2004, I'd have to write to NASA to request beta tapes be sent during shuttle missions.
Yes,
and
right.
they would FedEx those overnight from Houston to our New York offices. And then our team here would grab those mission day highlights. So they would arrive the second day and then send them back to NASA because you can't keep them. And that was the process. So you wouldn't be getting instant video as fun. And even that was fast, right? Compared to the 80s or whenever that folks were getting video and feeds from NASA. And so now you just get it straight from the astronauts on the space station via Twitter. You can get it directly from them, which is just amazing to see. But it does accelerate that cycle that we were talking about earlier.
Well, and you mentioned Twitter. We're talking about Twitter. We're talking about these remote camera images of rockets and so forth, 24/7. What that shifts for me, there's a lot less preparation. Sometimes there's no context, none at all. You're looking at a rocket or let's say an engine test out at Boca Chica at Starbase, and suddenly there's a pop sound and a big flash of light, and there may or may not be anybody commentating on that. If they are, it's probably off the cuff and kind of unprepared and a lot of conjecture. And there's so much to discuss around this, and I don't want to dive too deep into this part of it, but years ago, decades ago, anything like that was reported probably wouldn't have been live unless it was a launch for the Apollo program or something. And there would be a story written around that and context provided, and you still do that. But a lot of outlets that are streaming or people who are posting on Twitter who are journalists, it's a momentary thing. I mean, you have to come up with it right now. So you take your best guess, and there's a lot of looking in the magic 8 ball and kind of shaking it around, seeing which answer comes up. And then you may have to correct it later. But also, I think the expectations external to the news operation are not as high. There's a lot more doubt, but there's also a realization that people are doing things in real time, and you don't have time to go necessarily and vet all your sources unless it's a story that's being written downstream. And that's a big challenge. I assume it is for you too.
You do have to be careful, especially if anyone who's listening, you should always be careful by whatever you see on social media and online, right? It's always good. It's always good to kind of look for sources. We always try at space.com to cite the sources. Usually if it's from a NASA announcement or from another publication, we have links that go back so that you can see where it came from and how it was vetted. There was a meme going around of, oh my God, look at the moon flying so low over the North Pole. I'm not sure. Did you see that, Rod?
It's going to crash into Earth.
This amazing video. Oh, it's truly spectacular. The moon is like this giant thing. It's at its closest point to Earth. It's so low. You look, you can touch it. It's so huge. It blocks out half the sky. 100% fake. 100% fake. And yet still it goes super viral and people are asking us about it. Like, why is they're all scared about, oh my God, the moon is so close. No. So you do have to be really careful about a lot of that stuff. And sometimes it means waiting and not being first because you want to be sure about what's happening and what's going on. You also need to make sure that you get permission to use any images that you do. A recent story, there were some spectacular views of a recent SpaceX rocket launch that created a blue spiral over New Zealand. That was amazing, but it takes time to find the people that took the pictures and make sure that they want to share them with you. And they say that they can. And if you don't do a lot of that diligence at the upfront, then later on, when they find out that you've used their images without permission, it's going to be a bad day for you. And that's something that all digital publications have to worry about. And so there is kind of this balancing act that you have to perform on a day-to-day basis. But, with advanced planning and knowing what to expect, it hasn't been that big of a hurdle. But you're right. You have to be very judicial in what you're seeing. Well, and I don't want to keep harping on it, but because we cover a lot of national space agencies like NASA, the European Space Agency, Roscosmos, the source content is for the most part always public domain, or it's meant to be released. And so it's a little bit easier on that front to get things done. But I think what is a space story is a much wider category now than it was at the earlier days of space reporting and the space news. Because by then it was very, very niche, like you say. It was NASA, it was Russia, there were these rockets and whatnot. And today, so many people are doing their own thing, building their own satellites or balloons, that anything that kind of sparks that wonder, that connects people to space is what I consider a space story. But that might be different for another publication that only wants to write about model rockets or only wants to write about the science of it. Or maybe they want to curse in their stories, which you won't find a lot of curse words on space.com, but there are some sites that have that kind of style. So there's a lot of different categories and styles for what type of reporting you want to find too.
Well, I think it's the big.
I was gonna say, I think it's amazing that we're in a day where I think we might have talked about this a couple of times, that we've got so many things happening that it's hard to know what to cover. But there's also so many different ways that people can get access, can personalize their own space experience, because it is an experience. We don't get to go, you and I, Rod, very easily, unless, are you sitting on a few $1 million? Right? You can maybe comp me a trip on a Virgin Galactic. No, right? But so this is how we interact through the news that we find, how we share that. I've got models that I build with my daughter, things like that, that sort of stuff. That's how we express our spaceness on Earth, and you can kind of personalize your experience now, which is great.
Well, so I think kind of implicit in the title of this week's episode is for people who are interested in writing or reporting for space journalism. Let's talk about that a little bit. So one of the big shifts over the last couple of decades is this huge move towards freelance. There are very few reporters embedded places anymore. I mean, when Artemis 1 launches, for instance, there will be plenty of people sent by traditional networks and so forth, and lots of freelancers going down there, however many NASA will accommodate, to go watch the launch and cover the mission, even though it's going to be a fairly long one this time. But that's different than the way it used to be. It used to be there was a handful of reporters. They were working on staff for CBS or the New York Times or what have you. And there's still some of that, but increasingly it's freelance. And in the freelance field, you're not paid regularly. It's very hit or miss. The rates tend to be pretty low for the most part, although there are exceptions. And the levels of training and background for those people are kind of all over the map. And if you're running an operation like yours or even mine, you have to feel out the people that you're bringing in to try and figure out, do they know what they're doing? Do they understand how to vet facts? Do they understand if they're going to pull an image off the internet? Do they know how to make sure it's public domain? Do they make sure it's even a picture of the right rocket or the right spacecraft or the right people at the right time? If there's a person under 18 in that image, is there parental permission that's been granted to use it? So there's a lot to know. And if you're not formally trained in a journalism program, which you were and I was not, that stuff you have to kind of learn on the job. And so while it's a huge opportunity for people who want to get into the field, it can make it a lot harder for people at the top, executive editors and so forth, to be able to sort through all this. And I imagine you find that to be quite a challenge. I remember when I started writing space journalism, it was because you guys gave me a break and said, yeah, you can write some stories. And the first ones, frankly, sucked pretty hard. I kept your editors very busy for a while. And I didn't really get better at it until I was working at Caltech for a year, writing news for them. And then I thought, oh my God, I was so embarrassed for the early work I did for you. But
we have editors. Rod. That's what editors are for.
So. Well, I know, but I didn't. I'm not supposed to make the work that hard, right? And now I'm in your position, so I get stories in occasionally for the magazine, where I just kind of look at it and I think, oh my God, I'm going to have to rewrite 30-40% of this. And as an editor, you don't want to put words in their mouth. You don't want to change their storytelling. You just want to make it work for your publication or your venue, and be safe and accurate and not include anything in it that's going to get you sued. But it's a huge challenge.
It's a relationship, just like any other relationship. Yeah. And there is, editors are always taking a risk with a new freelancer, but there are signs, based on what they write. They usually have examples or clips, and you make your best judgment from that. And then you take the next step forward. If you find a good relationship where they really get your site and your tone, then you foster that with more stories, or you ask for tips. Some writers like just having assignments sent to them. Some like to really pitch and get deep into a story and take some time with it. Some just want to write features. Some just like to do really short little picture stories, that kind of thing. So it's a relationship that you foster kind of over time. And I did freelance for the first few years as well, until I became staff at space.com in 2000. I became staff in 2004, but I had been interning since 2001. And so I was doing a lot of freelance back then. And I had relationships with different editors at different sites. Not all of them were space. Some of them were just industry or super nitty-gritty biotech. It was very difficult to write there. But they were relationships that you just have to nurture, both as a writer and then also as an editor, to make sure that you're meeting each other's needs and expectations over what stories are going to run on the site. But at the end of the day, the editors are gatekeepers, and they need to make sure that they're growing their sites in the direction that they want to go in, and covering all of the different things that they would like to cover. And that's the really exciting part, is finding folks that are in different niches that are really good at certain things.
So kind of hinging off what you just said, there's a certain level of responsibility. There's a lot of people that want to write for publications like ours and other operations, and anybody can jump on YouTube or Twitter or these days, or start a blog or a website. And, whether or not they rise and survive in the field probably depends on how well they tell a story, because this is all about storytelling at the end of the day, whether it's short form, long form, deep dive, or just kind of a quick glance. But there's a responsibility on the people, on the content creators, to do their job well. So part of that is telling us, illustrating the story with words or images as they see fit. But there's stuff that, again, you went to journalism school. They teach you a lot about integrity, and they teach you about media law, and they teach you about how to avoid libel and slander, and they teach you about how to make sure that images you use are cleared properly and so forth. And there's a lot to know. So if somebody's new, and you and I both are kind of freelance fed, so we both hire freelancers, what would you recommend for somebody who's looking for some basic training and experience in this? And then how do they come to us? So you give your version, I'll give mine.
Well, I mean, I think there's a lot of great media law books that you can read to kind of get an idea of what. I mean, I think that starting out is always to ask questions about how you're going to get material and whatnot, right? You have to always be upfront and transparent about your sources. That's number one. Number two is if you're taking any kind of a compensation to do a story, you have to be upfront about that as well. Right. So, at space.com, we have a whole e-com team that reviews products, and you'll see at the top of space.com, there's a disclaimer that says that they do that. And that, anyone that buys anything from that, that there could be that we could get, a piece of that. We want to be upfront about that. And we also have a whole article about how we test stuff on space.com too, for that side of things, so that people know that it's not just a play. We're trying to actually help inform folks about that. On the flip side, when it comes to news, we are citing all of those sources. We're making it clear if we were at an event, we were there at the event, with date lines and that sort of thing, to identify exactly how that news was gathered, and that's the really important part on where to start. So kind of learning. Learning to gather your sources, working when it comes to reporting out space, working with the NASA relations people is a good place to start, to say, hey, I'm starting out. I'd like to make a contact. Can we arrange an interview to talk about what you do? That could always help as well, especially if you're trying to cover an event, because you will have to get experience covering an event. You can't just show up without a publication at all and say, hey, I'd like to go see a launch. That's a spectator, and
right.
You can buy a ticket
tourist
for that. Exactly.
Yeah. All right. Well, we're going to come back and talk about this some more, because I want to talk about pitching and about money just after this message from our sponsors. So let's say I'm a new freelancer, heaven forbid,
actually, Rod, can I cut in really quick? Because just in the break, I had a thought. You asked where people can start, and yeah. I missed like the completely obvious thing. Is I actually got my start at space.com as an intern, and that was something that the opportunity was mentioned to me by another person that was an intern at space.com, Heather Sparks. If you're out there, thank you very much. So, but that is a really great way to get the experience that you might need to get your feet wet in space reporting. There's lots of publications out there. Many of them have space beats and are accepting interns. And if they aren't, then they're accepting folks that they want to teach the craft of journalism in general. And the essentials for it all are laid out, regardless of what you're doing. And there are some specifics, like for NASA, you need to know how to deal with government agencies. That might be a little bit different if you're not doing that kind of government agency news. But that is a really great place to start to learn the basics of what, how deadlines work, what makes a story, how to gather stuff and turn a story around in a few hours, or even in an hour, depending on how it's developing. That's how I learned. I was an intern at the Los Angeles Times before I was staff there, and then again an intern at space.com when I was learning about space reporting before I became a staff there a few years later. So I want to just make sure I want to make sure that I'm on the record for that, because I really believe in internships and how valuable they are, because I learned a lot from them. So,
well, lucky you. I didn't have one, but I appreciate that you did, and that's good advice. So, I was trying to think of what are some of the things that help somebody prosper in this field, and a few words come to mind. They're generally adaptable. They're tenacious. They realize they're not going to be paid a lot for this, depending on who they're working for. It can be more or less. So they're probably frugal. And interestingly and increasingly so, and this is certainly true in book authoring as well, there's kind of this inverse bell curve of young on the left and older on the right. And it's people, for the most part, you're one of the exceptions, but at least on the freelance side, for the most part, I'm finding folks that tend to either be fresh out of college and they don't have a lot of expenses yet, they don't have a mortgage and 3 kids to support and so forth, or they're older, maybe nearing or past retirement age, and have time to devote to this that is not going to be terribly well compensated in most cases. And if they're mid-career, they're often college professors or somebody that's got some kind of a job that allows them the time and perhaps rewards them for creating this kind of work that's published outside of their normal environment, whatever their work environment is. And that they understand the difference between space journalism and science journalism. Some space journalism is science journalism, but as opposed to pure science journalism, I think space journalism is a mix of science and understanding engineering critically, because there's so much engineering involved, and the business of it, and doing all that in a way that is compelling storytelling, which is not something that's always easily acquired. And depending on who you're writing for, if it's a feature, you've got kind of a story arc like you do in a good piece of fiction or a nonfiction book, even though it's compressed in an article. And if it's a shorter form piece, you really got to get through the facts, and you still need a beginning, a middle, and an end, but it's much more compressed. Is that what you find?
Well, no, I think in terms of who is writing the stories, it's at space.com. It's across. It's a wide range. It's all gamut. I can't say that there's one type versus another. Just because I've worked with so many amazing writers over the years and right now, but each story is different. We have shorter stories that are just like, oh my gosh, gee whiz, look at this. And is that a science story? Well, it's more like a, oh my gosh, it's an amazing type story. But I would make a case that all space journalism is science journalism, because it's rooted in an underpinning of an understanding of what space is, how exploration is done, why is it important for people to read about it now, what are its effects on society, and the fact, and I hope that our readers will go out and look for this, but the fact that you saw that articles about the James Webb Space Telescope won a Pulitzer Prize this year from Quantum Magazine, and Natalie Woltover there, the really talented writer, shows you that there is intrinsic value to space reporting as a method of science journalism. So there is. I mean, I was really amazed. And in fact, I worked with Natalie over when she was at Live Science, our sister publication, a few times. We actually sent her on a 0G flight, and she had a great time and ended up with a really great.
Her too, huh?
Oh my gosh!
I'm never going to let this one go. Sorry. Okay, well, you'll have a chance to make up for that on my upcoming Arctic trip, but we'll talk about that later. Something else is probably worth mentioning, and then I want to get a little more into pitching and so forth, is, first person versus third person. I got a lot of stuff that comes in written in first person, which I can't use because I don't do that for a bunch of reasons, mainly, I think primarily because it just invites too much of that kind of thing, and that's not the format of our magazine. But also there's reporting the facts versus conveying your opinion. And sometimes people get confused about that. And it is kind of a blurry line, but you have to be very careful to not inject your opinion or editorialize too much when you're trying to write one of these pieces, especially in features.
So, well, it does depend on what you want to get out of it too, right? Mm-hmm. At Space, we have like an opinion section for that sort of reporting and for that kind of commentary. And but I think that there is value in first person, because space is, to me, space exploration is experiential. I mean, we can all look up at the night sky and marvel at the moon. By the way, the full moon of July is a supermoon, right? So everyone should look up at the full moon.
Here comes the clickbait.
It's going to be great.
Closer to the Earth than ever.
But I tell you, but there are different ways to connect readers, because we don't all. I would love to go to space. I think it would be amazing to look at the planet from above. Is it likely I will fly in space? Probably not, right? And the way that
I don't know. You got a 0G flight. I think it's probably more likely they're going to fly you on Blue Origin than me. Just saying.
Knock on wood, Rod. Knock on wood.
Yeah.
So a space reporter can still can still hope, but it's what are the ways you want to convey? What's the meaning? The story you want to convey? Is it an experiential one? I did this and it was amazing, and this is why you should do it too, or which I feel everyone should go see a rocket launch. And I have very strong feelings if you live on the East Coast about if you should go to Florida first to see one, or if you should go to Virginia, which I say that you should go to Virginia. It's the best place ever to see a first rocket launch. And if you live anywhere nearby, it's the most economically efficient way to do it. We should probably do a whole episode on how to see a rocket launch.
Those are wimpy rockets. They're little dinky
Not for
things.
long. Not for long.
Okay.
But so there's a place for that kind of thing, and shaping that story and that experience for the reader, I think, is really fun to craft, and it's fun to work with writers to develop that too and go forward. So it is something that has to be worked out in advance. You know, the last thing I want to leave the last thing I want to have for a freelancer is to leave them a lot of lingering questions about what the story needs to be or what I'm hoping to get out of it. Now, they should write it in their own style, but you know, if it's going to be first person, we'll discuss that in advance. So I think that communication is really key to making sure that you're covering stuff and not missing stories, but also embracing the personal styles. Because would Natalie Wolchover's stories have won a Pulitzer for James Webb at another place where they forced a different style on her? It's who knows. Again, she's really amazing, so it's very possible. But those were really long stories, and maybe if being forced into a shorter format, it would have been a lot harder to get that sense across and the information across, which is what really led for that winning combination to get the accolades that it did. And so trying to kind of find the balance for a specific site. For space, we emphasize the nowness. This is happening now. Most people don't know that there are 7 people on the International Space Station, you know, all doing different things from different countries, working around the clock. But I can see it from my porch, and that's the connection that we try to make. Because if you can't go personally, at least you can know about the people that are up there and what they're doing and all the fun stuff that they do in addition to the hard science. So.
Let's talk a little bit about pitching. So you mentioned rocket launches. I agree everybody should see one someday. But unless I'm looking for an experiential piece or maybe an opinion piece, depending on what you've got to say, you know, if you go, like if somebody I know goes up to see a rocket launch at Vandenberg, a Falcon 9 takeoff, that's not really a news item because it happens these days every week. And unless it's a particularly meaningful mission in some way, it's just not news. It may be for some sites, but it's not for mine. We in particular look for stuff about exploration and development, commercial development, especially of space, and anything to do with human settlement and habitation out there. And you look for different things, but it's important to kind of know not just what you want to tell, but why that might be a newsworthy story. So when people are approaching you as a freelancer, what do you want to see from them?
Well, I'd like to make sure that they know what the site is and how the site works, you know, because space.com is different than the New York Times or maybe The Verge or other online publications like Space News and whatnot. You know, we're not as industry focused as Space News is, but we're also not as poppy as maybe what Screen Rant or Newsweek or Yahoo might be doing when they're doing space news. So having a knowledge of what the audience might be like by scanning the site and identifying what type of article you want to write is really helpful, and having a knowledge of who you're pitching to. You know, there's information on our About Us page that says if you want to pitch, you should pitch to these people, and this is who you contact. And instead of sending it to a generic email, that, you know, showing that you've done some research, that's really, really key. So those two things for me are foundational. And then I kind of have an ethos that any story can be about space, because like right now, Rod, you and I are in space right now, even though we don't know it. We're on Earth, which is traveling through space 1,000 miles an hour as we're turning around. And so, you know, showing that connection that the reader will have for the story is really good. So.
Well, and it's interesting. You mentioned know your venue. So I'm sure you get all kinds of bizarre pitches. I get fewer, but some. And it astonishes me that somebody would look at our magazine, and I think a lot of them don't. I think they see the listing in Writer's Digest or something and pitch. But I'll get pitched on stories about UFOs or astrology or video games, or my favorite, religion in space. And it's clear, if you look at Ad Astra, either online or in print, we don't do those things, and yet we get those pitches. So it's really smart, especially if you don't want to piss off an editor right up front, to understand not just what they're carrying, but who their audience is. You and I both really, as you just pointed out, we publish material for a broad general lay audience. There are other publications that publish things for people that are working in the aerospace trade. There are others that publish things for kids. So it's important to know your venue, because depending on which publication or outlet you're pitching to, you may only get a couple of shots before they start not reading your emails. And I'll read everything. But basically what I want from people is one paragraph pitch of what your story is, and maybe some discussion or description of why you're the person to write that story. It's kind of like a book pitch. You know, when I do book pitches, they're usually about 30 pages, and it's divided into thirds. And of course, pitching an article is different. It's much more compressed. But in a book pitch, it's like, okay, what's the story, and why is it something that absolutely has to be told? Who are you, and why are you the one person in the universe that should be telling this story? And then the third part, which isn't really relevant to journalism, is kind of a market comparison and telling me how you're going to go out and do all this extra work so that the publisher doesn't have to pay to sell the book. So for freelancers for your site and my magazine, they don't have to worry about that third part. But I think the first two parts are kind of important. Do you have a set format that you want pitches in?
No, I get pitches of all kinds, but you're right. You want to know what the story is, why is it important, and why that writer is the one that should write it for you. And sometimes it is that they're just in the right place at the right time, or they've got really great contacts and they're going to get behind a story with an angle that you've never seen before. I always want to see how it relates to the reader, what they're going to learn from that, because at space.com we used to say, and I like to say it to myself every morning when I wake up, is that we like to bring something amazing every day. And so what's the amazing part of it? And sometimes I will ask that from my team members. It's like, what's the amazing thing from the story? Like, why should we really care about this new iteration of a mission design or this new study? And I think that's the key. I'd like to see that. Like, what are the sources they want? How long is it going to take? You know, how long is the story they want to pitch? Is it a feature or is it a really shorty? You know, that kind of a thing.
Does your wife look at you funny when you say that to yourself every morning?
In the mirror, right? Just like, amazing. No.
Find something astonishing. So I'm not going to go too much into my career path because it was a very odd one, and it's something that I wouldn't recommend because I didn't really get into writing, well, at least not journalism, until I was in my 50s. And prior to that, I'd written for television, for History Channel and other outlets. But I kind of came to it out of desperation because while I enjoyed writing books, it's a huge commitment. It's a year or two for each one. And I wanted to be able to have a more diverse set of shorter projects in the interim so that I wasn't just grinding on one thing for a year at a time, and the income doesn't hurt. But I think you followed a more traditional path. So tell us about your trail to space.com.
Yeah, well, as I mentioned earlier, I did study print journalism, newspaper reporting in undergraduate, so at the University of Southern California in Los Angeles. And it was through that program that I went to an internship fair, and I found out that the Los Angeles Times was starting a new section. It was very local. It was going to be in Orange County there, and they needed interns for that. And so I did an internship there for, I guess, about a summer or so, and you know, it was a lot of fun. Again, this was general news. I've always been interested in space, but I didn't really think about it as a career. And they were hiring writers, and that's how I got my first job. I was a city writer for the city of La Habra in Orange County, and the education reporter for Fullerton, which is just next door. And I did that for about a year, maybe a year and a half or so, before they shut that entire division down. You were joking about pink slips earlier, and that was like my first job, is that they shut the division down after the paper was bought by I think then the Tribune Company, and I got kind of sidelined over to a weekly publication called the Huntington Beach Independent, also published by the New York Times or the Los Angeles Times. And that was really interesting because it was a coastal community. I was living in Long Beach, so it was a much easier drive to the office. You could just go down Route 1, which was Highway 1, which was a lovely scenic drive. And And I covered Boeing was based there, so I got to go to I got to drive by Sea Launch, if you remember the Sea Launch complex. It was there every day when I drove down to the office, and there was a lot of environmental stuff going on at a wetlands preserve called Boca Chica, and there was a lot of science going on at a power plant that was having algae blooms offshore. So I got interested in writing science at that
Bolsa
time.
Chica. Bolsa Chica.
Bolsa Chica, yeah, not Boca Chica.
Yeah.
Oh my
Boca
gosh,
Chica is SpaceX.
Little pocket, Bolsa Chica. Oh my gosh, that's two worlds colliding right there. But that was a lot of fun, and I had a really good time. But that too came to an end where they eliminated my position there, so I was eventually laid off after about 2 years of working for it, and it was really dispiriting, right? Because you're excited, you're a new writer. But I had been writing about the science, and I'd luckily been able to write my first ever space story for the I guess then 30th anniversary of Apollo 11. It's when I met Buzz Aldrin for the first time. That was a lot of fun. I may have a signed photo of him somewhere around. I think I paid $2 for it or $6 for it. I had to pay for it.
Hey, if you want that signature today, it's going to cost you $600, pal.
Yeah. So that was kind of, I knew that I wanted to write about space, and I had done some research, and I found out that New York University had a science and environmental reporting program. So I went there for graduate school, and it was there that when I started in 2001, that they said, "Hey, space.com is looking for interns." And I went in, and it was just what I was looking for. And I felt very lucky ever since, because I was an intern there for 3 years until 2004, when the spaceflight reporter Jim Bankey left the company and went into private work. And so I felt very lucky that I kind of slid into that spaceflight reporter position and just really never left. I just kind of hung on for dear life for the last
You're a lifer.
well, the last 16 years from when I started. Then 16, more than that, 18 years at that point in time. So that's kind of how I got here. And in 2009, I became managing editor. 2019, editor in chief. So that's the progression.
Well, and I think
I think my stars every day.
that while it doesn't hurt to have formal training in this area, and there are a number of good programs. I was trying to look up some of the science. I have not yet seen a space journalism program, but there are science journalism programs, really good ones at Boston University, MIT, NYU, Columbia, UC Santa Cruz, Stanford, Washington Lee, Northwestern, Georgetown, Columbia, and the University of Southern California, if you must, which is where you went.
If they have a science reporting one, that's new. The Santa Cruz one is training. Like
that's one of the old standbys. But you can learn it on the job. And as you point out, part of the job of editors, whether they like it or not, is to kind of bring along that new crop of writers. One thing that I look for in particular for Ad Astra is anything to do with the new generation of kids coming into this, either as a business or as an avocation. Anything STEM oriented that has to do with space, because it's hard to get good news on that. Not the local bake sale for your Boy Scout troop to help them get astronomy merit badges. That's a good story. It's just not for us. But for bigger programs, organized programs about STEM, we love to run stuff on that. Of course, anything about the human settlement of space, especially big picture stuff. People who read my magazine know who Jerry O'Neill is and what he wrote about in the 70s and the high frontier and so forth. But new developments or new plans, it's hard to find. I see a couple of things a year that really pertain to that, and they're hard to find and even more difficult to write about. And if people want to pitch, they can send an email to editorial@nss.org. That's editorial@nss.org. But before we wrap this up, let's talk about the elephant in the room. How much people get paid? So there are staff jobs that pay pretty well. There aren't a lot of them. Most people are going to be freelance. And those rates range from, for a feature for an established venue, you can make, I think, still $600 to $1,200, all the way down to zero. So what can people expect in this field?
Well, I think it really, when I started as a newspaper writer, it was very, very low at the Los Angeles Times. So there are different variations. I can comment on what we pay for freelance, if that's all right, Rod. And we have specific rates for certain types of stories. So we have really short stories, and I don't feel it's any secret, because this is what I tell freelancers so that they can pick what option that they want to pitch for. But we have feature stories that start at about 200 or so, and it can vary between there depending on the level of effort required or the time, or if it's travel or whatnot. And those are for, maybe an interview or 2 interviews for a story that's going to be 600 words or so, and maybe it'll take a couple of days to report, and they can slot that into their other work if they're freelance. We also have really, really short, fast turnaround things like, look at this picture. Oh, it's amazing. Here's an announcement from NASA that we'd like to write up. And those usually start around 75, 100, depending on how detailed the releases are for that. And those are rates that we've been using over years, but we always do negotiate depending on how much expertise, how much additional work is needed, because they're not all the same. Not all of these things are the same. Sometimes things can be a bit more complicated than we expect. And so we have a lot of back and forth with our writers about that. And so that's kind of like the approach that we do take when it comes to freelance, and we really try to look for the stories that will move our readers to a new level of space understanding or whatnot. But we are online at the end of the day, and so we do need shorter stories, and so that's kind of what our rates are all based around. A magazine is going to pay more. Sometimes they might even pay $1 a word which is really a really great rate. I'm not sure what the rates are at Astra, but that was some of the things that I did find when I was working in magazines from some biotech companies and whatnot. And industry publications tended to pay a little bit more because they're geared towards industry. They need a lot of background on, especially for space, what goes on at the government level or at regulation level for the subject matter there.
So I need to amend my email address, because I just got a text from one of my coworkers saying that they weren't sure that editorial was working as an email address. So let's amend that to rod.pyle@nss.org. And we pay $250 a feature, $150 for a book review, and we don't do fiction, we don't do poetry, we just do factual space books, whether it's history or policy or what have you. So I'd like to close on my best attempt at a clickbait title, because, it's important to have good titles for your articles. So I think mine, the next time I pitch you, Tariq, is going to be, you won't believe how shocking it is when aliens invade, but your jaw will drop when you try this one weird trick to deter extraterrestrial invaders, and you could do it at home in your spare time and make money too.
I love it. I would say find 4 more tricks so we can say 5. So.
Oh, because we like lists, right?
That's right.
All right.
That's right.
Well, thank you very much for joining me today, my friend, and thanks to all of you for listening. You can send us feedback at twis@twit.tv. New episodes of this podcast publish every Friday on your favorite podcatcher, so make sure to subscribe and tell your friends, and give us 5 stars or a thumbs up or whatever it is they're asking for, because every little bit helps. And you can always head to our website at twit.tv/TWIS. We will see you next time.
Listeners of this program get an ad-free version if they're members of Club TWiT. $7 a month gives you ad-free versions of all of our shows, plus membership in the Club TWiT Discord, a great clubhouse for TWiT listeners. And finally, the TWiT Plus feed, with shows like Stacy's Book Club, the Untitled Linux Show, the Giz Fizz, and more. Go to twit.tv/clubtwit, and thanks for your support.